another. Now, the last thing we're going to look at are some important strikes. The AP handbook calls for you to know about some of the confrontations. So here's some that you could mention and what sparked them and how they. All right, so today what we're going to be really looking at is the rise of early labor unions in American history, why they developed, what conditions were like for workers, and how they responded through unions, and then also how companies fought them and what the stance of the U.S. government was. So, of course, there's going to be financial panics, there's going to be economic downturns, and we're going to look at a couple important strikes that happened during those times and what the results were. And of course, what are they fighting for? Well, they're fighting for wages, they're better wages, they're fighting for better working conditions. And of course, they're going to confront business leaders with a variety of strategies that we turned out. Now, as you can see, this is just 1870 all the way to 1900, and we see a number of strikes. We're going to look at the Homestead strike, we're going to look at the Great Railroad strike, and we've already mentioned Haymarket, and we're also going to mention the Pullman strike, which have ultimately spread to 27 different states. And we can see a lot of them are up here in the northeast, but they did have an impact across the country. Now, one group to mention are the Molly Maguires. Now, the Molly Maguires were largely Irish people who formed almost a terrorist organization called the Molly Maguires, and here they were eventually caught, and 20 of them were executed for crimes of kidnapping, but there was very little evidence to it. And these were mine workers, and this is a scene from the movie that I think will give you an idea of what life was like for those miners. It was very, very, very tough work. So let me go ahead and play that. Here's the scene, or here's the poster from the movie. Now, this is before the invention, of course, of electricity and lights. They would have worn little candles on their helmets. Of course, cave-ins were very, very common, burying workers still sadly to this day, but even more dangerous then. Imagine what they would have inhaled, and smoke, and the dust, all of course cancer causing. Standing there all day doing that. My father did coal mine when he was a young boy. Here you see the pushing the cart with the coal, and of course the coal is going to have to go through the breakers, the men that will go through it and try to separate the better coal from the less good coal. The movie does a really good job of showing you the conditions that these folks labored under. It stars, of course, the great James Bond actor Sean Connery, as well as Richard Harris.
Both late and early, and get but little pay to support our wives and children in free America. If Satan took the black legs, I'm sure 'twould be no sin. What peace and happiness would be for us poor working men. 8 hours we'd have for working, 8 hours we'd have for play, 8 hours we'd have for sleeping in free America.
Now, one of the first big strikes that happens is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 that spread to many, many different states. Now, during the Panic of 1873, which lasted for many years, or was essentially a depression, although they used the term panic in those days, the railroad saw less business and fewer people were traveling, so it cuts wages, and uh, union workers call for a strike on what was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And if you play Monopoly, you know the B&O, Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and eventually it spreads to 11 states. Three-quarters of the nation's railroads, which then were mainly focused here in the eastern part of the United States, were shut down. And you can see all the places in red here are cities where there were strikers who refused to work. And eventually, what we get is a sympathy strike, where non-railroad workers who are supportive of these workers go on strike as well too, to show their sympathy, to show their support. Now, how has it ended? Well, this is very typical of the time. The President of the United States decides to send in federal troops, and many workers end up being killed. When I was visiting Pittsburgh, I saw several historical, or as my wife calls them, hysterical markers that describe what happened there, particularly in Pittsburgh. But so the federal government was used to end this strike, and 100 different workers are killed in all of this fight. It's quite bloody. The last one that we're going to look at is the Homestead Steel Strike in 1892 in or near Pittsburgh as well. Now, what was happening here was this was right before the big panic of 1893, and times were actually good, as you'll see on a graph coming up. But Carnegie had really come to sort of believe that the Union had gotten control of this Homestead Steel Works, and he was really trying to get as much out of this as he could. He'd put a lot of money into it, and he really thought that the workers were controlling this plant, that they had too much power, and they'd had a contract that they'd made with the previous owner before he had bought it, and that contract was due to expire. And so they tried to negotiate with them, and the workers weren't willing, understandably, to take lower pay or to have less power. And so the company decided to try to break the union by locking them out and keeping them outside of it. And they actually built like a wall around the plant to keep them out. And they'd had the workers work extra hours, 12, 14 hours or more a day, so that they would have enough steel to outlast the workers. And of course, these workers in those days, they probably didn't have a strike fund to pay them, so they would be really bad off. Now, so what happens? The workers surround the plant, and Carnegie hoped to bring in replacement workers. But Carnegie, who always he wanted to be the nice guy. Remember his gospel of wealth and giving money away. Carnegie didn't really want to do the dirty work. So what he does is he leaves the country and goes to his castle that he's bought in Scotland. And he is there, and he leaves it up to Henry Clay Frick, and I'll show you a picture of him in just a sec, to do sort of the dirty work. And Frick's job, and he gives them power to do whatever it will take to basically get this plant working again. So they expect these replacement workers to arrive. So to get the workers out of there, to get the now striking workers, since their contract had expired, they're going to send in replacement workers. The company sends in people who are known as Pinkertons, and the Pinkertons had been a private national detective agency that you could hire. Some people saw them almost as a militia, not just as an intelligence group, and they had helped President Lincoln during the war. They'd even supposedly saved his life from an assassination attempt. And this is their motto. Okay, you see the all-knowing eye, and it says, "We never sleep." And it's believed that this is where we get the phrase private eye for detectives. Now here you see the barges, which had like railroad cars on them or something, that landed there to try to drive these workers away. Now, not all the Pinkertons were professional. They had hired just a bunch of local people as well too to try to break it. And what you end up getting is this battle on the river. They actually bring in, the workers set fire to a little boat, and they try to ram it. And we see this shooting, and the workers actually get the better of the deal, as you could see here in this video. Yeah, right. So here comes the barge. You go, girl. There's always a shot fired. Yep. When somebody starts shooting, everybody's got to shoot. And that's right. Rare historical footage here. And like a lot of places, they had really good racial relations and had taken in blacks and whites and immigrants as well there. Man, the cannons. Come and take this. Woo, that blew up real good. Hey, thanks for leaving us, eh?
On Pinkerton, he's sending watchmen. We're bringing them in by boat so that.
Now, the workers had a lot of sympathy from people around the country, and this is the guy that I said that Henry Clay Frick, the man that Andrew Carnegie had left running the mill and with the job of breaking the union. This guy was to do the dirty work, and basically by letters, he and Carnegie worked out, and Carnegie was able to have a plausible deniability, we call it, about what happened. And Carnegie did deny for the rest of his life that he had anything to do with the bloodshed there. Now, a lot of people around the country, because the Union folks had fought off the Pinkertons and had done such a great job on this battle on the river, they had a lot of support, and they were doing well. But then that all comes to an end when a man by the name of Alexander Berkman tries to kill Frick. He follows him. He comes into the office, and Frick is sitting there and looks up at him, I think, and Berkman shoots him. And Frick doesn't even ask to be hospitalized for a while. He just survives all this. He's a pretty tough guy. And as a result, Alexander Berkman cost the workers all of that support, and ultimately the workers will be replaced by scabs, by replacement workers. So Alexander Berkman qualifies as our nut here, the nut of the day.
Sometimes you feel like a nut, sometimes you don't.
For his actions there that had cost them so much. Now, Frick, also an interesting story here, had built a hunting lodge up in a town called Johnstown. And this, until 9/11, was the worst disaster in American history. What happened was, to be able to drive their carriages across this earthen dam, they had cut the dam down quite a bit. And many people had warned them, engineers, that the dam would be unsafe. And they all had their beautiful homes all around it, and I've actually been up there to see it. And so one night, the dam breaks. And in its wake, as you'll see here, it just comes down. And what kills so many people are, it literally picks up a railroad, cars, it picks up houses, and it, sends them down this river, and they kill thousands of people. And here you see a very famous image with the tree right into a house here. And here you see where the dam gave way. And I went up there, as I said, and visited, and you still see all the lodges, and you'll see piers that they had built to go out into this giant lake that had been formed by the river. But now it's just a big giant hole in the ground, and you can still actually see where the dam had been. But it just kind of shows you the way that Frick viewed a lot of the people downstream, that, hey, we need this for our convenience, forget y'all, okay? Now, the Pullman strike is the last one that we're going to look at here. And the Pullman strike of 1894 involves, once again, the railroads. Now, Pullman, Illinois wasn't supposed to be a bad place. It was supposed to be a model town with model citizens. And Pullman thought he was a good guy. He had built this whole town for his workers, where they would work in the factories. He had a church for them to go to. He had stores. He had a theater. He had a hotel there. He had his own gas works. He had everything there for the workers. And here you see the actual factory and the lumber that they used to make these Pullman cars. Now here you see a picture of the town. It's still there today, but it's not owned by Pullman anymore. The company went bankrupt in the 1950s. But Pullman had built this nice place for his workers to live in. It was clean and safe and everything like that. However, it was not really your town. It was a company town. If you wanted to shop, you shopped in his stores. You had to go a long way to get out of there. You gave him a lot of your wages back to be able to shop there. So he would get the money back from you that he had paid you to work for him. And so it's a company town, and that's a term you should know as well too. Now here we see a picture of Pullman, and here we see the Pullman car that the workers made. There were Pullman sleepers where people could pull down bunks and sleep during the night. There were Pullman dining cars, and nearly every train had some of these Pullman cars on them. So what happens? Well, during the Panic of 1893, Pullman cuts the wages, but he doesn't cut the rent. He charges them for their little apartments that they have. He doesn't cut the utility charges like for the gas or anything like that. He doesn't cut the prices in his company store. And so the workers, they go on what's called a wildcat strike. And this is something where you just go on strike without the bigger union, in this case the AFL, backing you. And the AFL actually opposed this strike and thought it was a bad idea. So what we see here is Pullman. You can see his name right here. He literally is tightening tightening this thing on the workers here. And you see his high rent but low wages. You see the employee here being crushed by it, and it says capitalism, monopoly, plutocracy, wage slavery, various names. So this is obviously very pro-worker and anti-Pullman. Now, a boycott follows up on this, and eventually it spreads to over half of the states in those days. And the railroads across the country just came to an end because workers sympathetically all across the country refused to handle any trains that had Pullman cars. And since almost all of them did, the railroads stopped. Now, what did the Pullman people do to stop this? Well, generally speaking, as you'll see, big business in the government, the government in those days supported big business. And so what happened was they decided to attach U.S. mail cars to the Pullman cars. Now, by law, if you interfere with the delivery of the mail, you are creating a federal crime. So now, if you refuse to handle the Pullman cars, you're refusing to deliver the mail. And with this, President Cleveland ordered an injunction. He ordered the workers to go back to work to stop the strike. He ordered Eugene Debs, the leader, who you guys heard about in the IWW, to listen to him, and they refused to do so. So finally, of course, soldiers were sent in to crush the strike, and here you see them shooting in the somewhat, pretty overdone picture of the shooter of the soldiers just shooting them. But 40 workers were killed. And of course, a lot of damage was done to the factory and plant here. Pullman ends up losing this system, this town, in the sense he kept his factory, but he couldn't run the stores anymore. He couldn't run the churches and everything like that. Now, one of the things AP wants you to be able to know are the tools that each side used when confronting the other. So we first have the tools of management. You can see them listed here. Scabs, replacement workers, often African Americans or immigrants who got caught up in the whole thing. The Pinkertons that you saw at the Homestead strike, the hired sort of goons or workers or hired guns to force workers to do what they want, locking workers out so that they wouldn't get paid. blacklisting of union leaders, where if you were a union leader or, as they saw it, a troublemaker, they would put your name on a list that they would circulate around to all the different companies to make sure you wouldn't be given a job. A yellow dog contract, which was supposedly a contract so stupid, how stupid was it, that only a yellow dog would sign it. Now, I don't know what their problem was with yellow dogs. I had a yellow dog. It was a beautiful golden retriever named Katie Scarlett, and Katie was awfully smart, so I really object to that. But anyway, the idea was you would never get a job unless you agreed not to join a union. We saw court injunctions. These were frequent deals where they were forced to not strike or to go back to work. The court was all too happy to do this, and this was the main way that the government got them to work and to fight the unions. And then they also had something called the open shop. The open shop is where they could not require you to join a union, which many union people wanted. They had their thing called the closed shop, where you had to join a union. So let's look at the tools of labor. What did they use? Of course, these two would come together and fight. Now, boycotts, where you get people not to buy products of that company, was a very common method and very successful, as we've seen in several strikes. Sympathy demonstrations or sympathy strikes, where other unions or even just consumers would protest or not buy, or would march for you, or they would go on strike. They would have picketing, where people carried signs that would tell why they were striking and giving people information about why they were striking, trying to get them to support the strike or not to cross the lines if they were a scab. They had their closed shop, where you had to join a union to get a job. It says copy, but it's job. And of course, organized strikes that were set up where they had a strike fund and you had the support of the national union. And then, of course, wildcat strikes like the Pullman strike, or strikes that the IWW often carried out, that didn't have the backing and were unannounced and particularly hard for companies to deal with. Now, what was the response to the government? How did the government handle unions? Well, first of all, you should know the Supreme Court case of Commonwealth versus Hunt in 1842. Basically, what happens in this case is a bootmakers union had been organized, and they were sued. The court found that as long as a union had a legal purpose and it used legal means to achieve its goals, it could not be banned. So that's an important moment. Now, you guys know the main philosophy of the time was so-called laissez-faire, a French term for leaving alone, leaving business alone. The government, might have said that, but it did what it could to support and help business most of the time in its court rulings and its numerous injunctions that it did. For example, in the Pullman strike, using the injunction to make them go back, sending in troops as they did in the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, and in the Homestead Strike. So if you have to talk about government and so-called laissez-faire, you should note those kind of things. When there were disputes, it almost always the government sided with business. Ironically, the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was created to fight monopolies, was used. The idea being that unions restrained free trade because they made it harder to get workers, and therefore they used it. It was, in fact, not until 1914 that they do exempt unions from the Sherman Antitrust Act with what's known as the Clayton Antitrust Act. The government would routinely arrest strike leaders, charging them with conspiracy or inciting violence, and as I said, using government injunctions as they did in the Great Railroad Strike. And as I've mentioned, the Clayton Antitrust Act, not until 1914 did it specifically exempt unions. Now, we won't talk about it, but the really heyday of the unions is going to come during the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, is going to pass numerous laws that will set up groups to support unions. The National Labor Relations Board, unions are going to grow tremendously during the time. And of course, they're still with us. Well, thank you for your attention. This is just to let you know this has been another fine production from...
Sometimes you feel like a nut, sometimes you don't.
Nuts.